Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy at Catholic Studies Academy. And today we are going to continue our discussion on Marxism. And last time, if it's good if you before you listen to this one, to go back and listen to our previous one, where we really dove into kind of the historical context of Marx and where he was coming from. And we focused on kind of two main philosophical positions that led to Marx and Marxism, which was Kantian idealism and the Hegelian view of history. And we talked also about the materialism of Marx and kind of the cultural thought that he brought to the forefront, specifically with his ideas of freedom, which took a very interesting turn if you've ever listened to any of our other podcasts on freedom. And so this week, what we want to do is continue our discussion of Marx and if we have time, get into his critique of capitalism and maybe even some of his good way to put it, I guess, is eschatology. So, Dr. Smith, why don't you get us started today? Where do we want to go from here?
So just a quick, as I said, there's a lot of material in that previous podcast. So if you haven't heard last week's episode, you want to go ahead and go back and listen to that first. A lot of Hegelian background there. Just to kind of refresh here, kind of get us oriented. Probably the most important contribution of Hegel to Marx, there's a couple of them, but probably at least one of them that's important to keep in mind, is the view that Hegel had that Geist, that is human spirit, or the human spirit, is really all about freedom. Freedom understood in a kind of Kantian way, which means deciding and choosing your life and making choices on the basis of a kind of universal perspective that's free from particular attachments, particular desires, or natural inclinations or anything like that. It's really, it's a kind of choosing that's beyond nature and beyond culture and beyond history, right? That's the kind of freedom that Hegel has in mind. And he sees that as the fullest realization of the human spirit. That goes along with a view of history. This is, again, Hegel, in which he sees history as the working out through certain ideas of freedom, right? So that what history is really about is the realization of the kind of freedom I was just discussing. And that when history reaches its culmination, that kind of freedom will be realized both subjectively and objectively. That is both within the lives of individuals, but also within a social, economic, and political domain, right? In which that kind of universal freedom beyond history and beyond nature becomes sort of manifest and realized. So that's the big sort of sweeping picture that Hegel lays out. That's what really got people excited about Hegel, right? That he had this kind of, I would call it a kind of a secular eschatology, in which, he gave meaning to history. You could find the meaning of your own life, your own relationships, your own struggles within that big story, right?
Right.
One of the very fine philosophers of the 20th and 21st century was a philosopher named Alistair Mcintyre. And in one of his works, several of his works, he advances the theme that human beings, for the most part, understand themselves within a particular narrative. That is the narrative that we adopt for ourselves is the framework through which we understand our own lives and the world around us. It's an interesting view, and I think seems something correct about it. Hegel gives you that kind of meta narrative about history and about your own life, right?
I was going to say, even St. Augustine, in his first catechetical instruction, there's a catechist who's like, I don't even know where to begin on bringing these people to Christianity. And he says, begin with the narratio. Begin with the story, that's so. I mean, it's not. It's so, like you said, it's especially for those that are maybe not Christian or not Catholic. That's kind of a universal, kind of attractive piece to us.
Sure.
Is that we belong to something. We belong to this story, to this. We have a part to play in this story.
That's right. Yes,
You know?
exactly. Yeah. And so Marx picks up on this, although he has an alternative narrative, right? That is, he basically inverts the Hegelian view. So the Hegelian view is freedom, the development of freedom through the history of ideas, right? Through the history of philosophy. For Marx, it is the development of freedom, right? But through the history of material conditions.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he calls his philosophy the material dialectic, right? As distinct from or in contrast to the idealist dialectic, right? We have the clash of ideas. What you have instead in Marxism, the clash of material conditions. So that's really how Marx kind of develops out of Hegel, and he does so by making a couple of very important little changes, right? But they're tweaks on the system, but they transform the whole system. So one is that in terms of identity here, he thinks that identity is entirely made up of our social relationships,
right?
And that our social value and that our freedom is expressed and realized in our productivity, in our material creations of things. So he talks about like what really distinguishes man from the animals. It's a classic philosophical question, and Marx knew that, but he gives a different answer than other people have ever given. He makes things, right? That is what distinguishes us, is we're tool makers, right?
Yeah.
And then of course he's correct, right? I mean, it's a couple of species make extremely primitive tools, but nothing like the microphone in front of my face or the glasses that I'm wearing or the earphones on my head, right? I mean, it's just total, categories of difference, right?
Using a rock as a hammer is a little different.
Right, exactly. So this is how Marx really transforms, right, Hegelian idealism into the material dialectic. He says, you are the sum of your social relations. So you're entirely defined by your social function, and your place in that social function is determined by your productivity. And freedom, right? So either you're free within the social system because you're productive, or you are servile and slavish within that social system because of your lack of production. So those two theses always go together: social definition and freedom as production. Any thoughts about that, or anything?
Yeah. I mean, I just want to highlight for our listeners that the idea that you are your the reduction of the dignity of the human person, or just the reduction of the human person to simply their social relationships. That's a very frightening idea, but it's one that whether it's framed that way or not, it's kind of like Pope Benedict used to talk about a practical atheism. Like we may not be overtly atheistic culture, but we're practically. I think that's that has a lot to do with kind of the culture we live in today, and it's something that as Catholics we need to push back against. That no, you are not just the sum of your social relationships. You are not just defined by those things. The human person is so much more than that, and you have to find your identity in the one who created you, not in just your relationships. Not to even get into your social relationships are based on your production like that. Right, goodness, you go down a whole nother thing there. But you can see where it's here.
What you're saying is key, Jason. I mean, if we think about yourself primarily in terms of social relations, right? I mean, it's just not primarily, but exclusively, right? Then you're really on the wrong track. And to follow up on your thought there, you're practically denying the reality of God and creation and the creator-creature distinction and relationship, right? What we fundamentally understand ourselves as within a Christian perspective and worldview it's not that work's unimportant. It's just that neither work nor social relations our highest or most fundamental identity.
Yeah, nor can they capture, I think, just the, who the human person is. And
Mm-hmm.
when we do, and that's the thing with, with social media,
Mm-hmm.
not saying it's bad, just saying it's a tool like anything else. But you can, yeah, I mean, you can use a hammer for anything,
Sure.
right? So it's one of those things where it I think that aspect of Marxism is, again, whether it's identified as that or not, it seems to find its way into our culture, and so I think with anything, we need to really push back against things like identity politics, or the idea that every choice is a binary choice, like, and either you're this or you're that, like there's no kind of range of things. So I think for our listeners, that's something huge to pick up on in the current discussions and talking points
Sure.
that we encounter today.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, I mean, the idea about the idea of the social construction of consciousness is extremely important. I mean, it's very alive today. That was really not to go too far off here, but that was really advanced by the Frankfurt School of Socialism, which was a later instantiation of Marxism. I said socialism, I would say Marxism. So it's kind of sometimes called Western Marxism.
Yeah.
But that became very important in the United States of America. People like Saul Alinsky, promoters of it. What you're saying is key, right? Is that this anthropology, right?
Yeah.
It's diametrically incompatible with Christianity, right? I think it's just really key to see that.
Yeah,
you're right about that. So one other element you want to add here is once you've accepted these two theses, right, then this brings to the fore the importance of the means of production, right? Because if your freedom and your status are dependent on your productivity, then it is absolutely key that you have access to the means of production. If you can't be productive, then you're not going to be realizing your freedom, and you're not going to be, and you're going to lose your social value. And so, whoever owns the means of production or has access to the means of production really is the one who is free. Now, of course, Marx recognized in his own day in society that many people didn't have access to the means of production directly, but only indirectly. And this brought out, he thought, there's a lot of strains in Marxism, but one important strain is this brings out, in his view, the alienation that's experienced within industrial capitalist society, where people are alienated from their freedom. So what does it mean to be alienated, right? You might remember in the United States Constitution or Declaration of Independence, right, we have inalienable rights, right? What that means is separated from. So this is meant to be old technical language, legal language. Sure. To be alienated from your property means to be separated from your property, right? To have inalienable rights, or to have rights that you're not separated from. So when Marx is using the term alienation there, he's talking about us being separated from our own freedom and therefore from our own social value. And so that's what we experience when we don't have the means of production. It's important to see how crucial that is, right? You're not going to really you're going to be degraded and servile if you don't have access to the means of production, right? So it's a important thing that we're going to find utilized in his critique. But first, you have to realize the positive value of the means of production. Tools, machinery, all that sort of stuff is of key importance because, right, of the emphasis that Marx puts on productivity and social value. So what we want to add, I think, today especially is, in this episode, is to look at what he has to say about culture and what he has to say about history. So there's a lot here. Culture. So one of the things, let's start with culture. We've built up now a view of the human person We've built up a view of the importance of machinery, tools, technology, right? Think about how unusual that is in philosophy to talk about such things, right? Like machinery is not something that people talk about hardly ever.
Ever. Yeah.
Right? I mean, Aristotle talks a little bit here and there about it, Plato a little bit here and there, but it's just not a theme, or is it a major theme, right, in the work of Marx. He also develops a very robust view of culture that goes with this. And so an important distinction to learn is the distinction between structure and superstructure. So the structure of any society. So once you start thinking this way, right, you start to realize, okay, if we accept the anthropology and we accept the importance of technology, then what we learn is that the structure of society, the real structure of society, is based on relations of production, right? So either the fundamental distinction is either you are someone who has access to the means of production or not, right? If you have access to the means of production, then you are free and non-servile. You might be less, free and have less dignity than another, right? But even that comparison is going to be based on your access to the means of production and your work, right?
Right.
That'll, of course, put you in stark contrast to those who lack the means of production and therefore are servile. That's the real, so this is so key, that's the real structure of society. Whether we're talking about churches or families or neighborhoods or whatever it may be, right?
Yeah.
All of that is really about, all of those relationships are reducible to relationships of production. So when you're thinking about, say, your work or your family, right? So he has a thing he wrote when he was young called The Holy Family, in which he critiques traditional family structure as being inherently exploitative, right? Because of the kind of hierarchical relationship between husbands and wives and men and women within the family at that time. And of course, he thinks basically, look, this is just a perfect example of, right? What we have here are relations of production, right? Who owns the means of production here?
Yeah.
The husband does, not the wife. And I think under the German law at that time, that's the way it was. And so, basically that reduces the wife to a servile position. And so we could go through anything like that. Look at companies, look at churches, all those sorts of things, right? You look at the Catholic Church, right? In a church, right, you have the producers who are priests, right? They produce the sacred things. And then there's those who receive the sacred things, but can't produce them, right? Well, basically that makes the laity, right, sort of servile vis-a-vis the priest, right? So you can see how you can apply this kind of almost to anything, right?
Yeah, and why is this such a big deal for Marx? And just, from what I know, every single strain of Marxism and socialism, that there always has to be these two opposing forces, the oppressed and the oppressor, or there always has to be this tension. There can't be harmony between these two. That never comes up. But it just seems like an essential structure of his whole thought is that there's always going to be these opposing forces, not good and evil, but just kind of again, his is based on materialism. Why is that? And this is not necessarily unique to Marx. It's found in a lot of other places. Why do you think that is?
I think to take Marx's perspective on it, I think so. Lots of time, I think you can find in sort of papal, or 19th century papal social teaching and early 20th century social teaching, kind of like a riposte or reply to Marxism is what you're talking about, where you have hierarchy and harmony, right? So you have differentiation of roles, but all those things work together, right? Yeah. So if you look at, say, there are different Catholic alternatives to Marxism that were developed, like syndicalism or distributivism. Yeah. In both of those kinds of views, there's kind of this idea of, well, there can be inequality, but that inequality contributes to the good of the whole, right? That kind of thing. With Marx, I think he sees it as it has to do with the logic of material possession, right? That is, either you have access to the means of production or you do not. That's a binary. That's a either or. It is or is not. And once you set that up, right, if you fall on one side of that, you're exploited, and if you fall on the other side of that, you're exploiter, right? And then maybe you could say, well, within that, okay, maybe you own the means of production, I own the means of production, but you own a lot more than I do. Well, okay, but still, like you're higher than I am because you have more, right? I'm not as bad as like those poor servile people who have none, right? Hence the middle class, right? The bourgeois, right? Who definitely want to hold on to, right, their kind of modicum status, where they're not totally servile, even if they're not sort of lordly capitalist, right? So I think it has to do with that. It's not about a spiritual cooperation. It's about material possession. And I mean, at the end of the day, Marx thinks private property degrades the human spirit for that reason. That it's that I have and you don't, right? That creates the situation, right, in which there is this dialectical opposition. See, if you got rid of private property and private ownership, right, Marx thinks then you dissolve that dialectic.
Everything becomes equal, right?
Everything becomes equal. It's not that I have and you don't, it's we. Right?
Just some are more equal than others,
access. Right? Well, maybe under the dictatorship of the proletariat, but we're getting ahead of ourselves.
And just for our listeners, these kind of ideas, found their way into, Catholic theology with, liberation theology and some of the other ones that Dr. Smith mentioned there, and all throughout.
That was liberation theology condemned? I just was curious.
Several times.
Okay.
If you ever want, one of my favorite images of Pope John Paul II is when I forget the guy's name now, but it's like as soon as John Paul II gets off a plane and he sees this priest, and he has he's got his finger in the priest's face, just letting him have it, because he was a big proponent of liberation theology, and he was actually trying to like run for political office or something like that as a priest. So it was horrible, and yes, it has been condemned. Good enough. But I'll throw this out there, not to get too off topic, but even in catechetics, Marxist ideas and Marxist influence came into effect to where, and there's even, one prominent catechetical theorist out there, Thomas Groom, who people still absolutely love. He still teaches, I think, up at Boston College. And his whole thing is we need to put our story and the Christian story in this tension. And then when they kind of work themselves out somehow into some kind of version of Christianity that is this, it's convoluted, but
catechetical dialectic.
It really is. I mean, when you have to write 600 pages on a methodology, I think there's something flawed there. But a big thing, I mean, and the thing is he says himself that he gives credit to a Marxist philosopher named Paulo Freire, again, bringing these things into tension, that this is how we understand the world. This is our worldview, that there's the oppressed and the oppressor, that there's that this is, we kind of just take this as a matter of fact and see how it works out, and again, it's like Marx, it's such a materialistic view of just the entire, not just the world, but the human person, work, no sort of consideration of the spiritual side of things like leisure. I mean, just completely ignoring, several hundred years, 1,000 years of philosophy,
Sure. Yeah, and rejecting it too. I mean, Marx is very clear about that, right? Truth without action is not truth. And the whole contemplative side of the human person, like we talked about last time, is just left out, in a Marxist account. And this is true in his view of culture. So if you accept, right, that the social organization is based really on relations of production, then you can ask, well, what about culture? Because you might say something like, well, we have ideas. This is how Hegel would approach it. We have ideas about private property or the dignity of man, and that helps us to structure our society and economic relations. Marx says, incorrect. The relationship is entirely inverse, right? Or I should say, is the reverse. That is, the material conditions and relations of production, being consistent materialist, determine your cultural norms, determine your consciousness, determine your ideas, right? You have the ideas you have, Jason, about private property and the value of hard work because you're bourgeois, right? That is because you are a property, you have access to the means of production at a low level, right? Or relatively low level, but you still have it. You own your own home, right? That sort of thing. Well, as such, you qualify as bourgeois, right? You are a property owner, a small property owner. And because of that, you value private property, right? Yeah. It's your material conditions that cause you to value private property. You believe in this abstract right to private property because that keeps you from falling into a servile position, right? But see, it's not a belief in private property that motivates your ownership of things, right?
Right. It's what conditions.
It's your ownership of things that motivates your belief in private property, right? And if you were part of the servile class, right, you might not have such a high view of private property. You'd probably think, hey, it should belong to everybody, right? So that's an example, right, of the idea that that culture, right, is driven by the real structure. So culture is considered the superstructure. So here you should think of superstructure not as like super as in determining or higher, but rather kind of like froth on the sea. It's kind of like it's what's on top, right? Kind of like in a building, right? You might have like the difference between, say, being an engineer and being an architect, right? The engineer is the one that creates the structure that upholds everything, right? In reality. The architect is who makes it pretty, right? Sorry to insult any architects out there, but gives it good design, right? And makes it attractive. So that's kind of like what philosophers, theologians, poets, artists, all those sorts of people, right? What they are doing really is expressing ideas that are conditioned by a more fundamental structure, right? Yeah. And that's the structure of the means of production. Let me give you another example of this. Let's say the myth of the Old West, right? So if you were a Marxist critic, one of the things that you would sort of critique about the United States of America, right, is the myth of the Old West, right? In which you have, the brave pioneer family or the slightly roguish but good lawman or independent loner gunfighter standing up for
John Wayne. Just say John Wayne. Just say John Wayne. We'll know what you mean.
Standing up for justice, right, etc. So when John Ford is making those movies that star John Wayne, what he's doing is he's perpetuating a mythos that justifies and aggrandizes American individualism, right? Do you see how that works?
Yeah.
Right? So John, of course, now it sounds like Marx is saying, "Oh, John Ford is sitting around plotting this out like it's a sinister conspiracy." It's just this is the way we are, right?
Yeah.
Is conditioned by those underlying structures, right, of economics, and from that, our conscious produces stories, ideas, myths that perpetuate that structure that we experience, right?
What about religion? Does religion have any place in culture, or how does Marx view religion then as coming from or its place in culture? How does he see it?
Well, he very clearly says that for most people, it's the opium of the people,
Yep.
right? That is, it's there to basically it it provides a kind of spiritual consolation
Yeah.
for material exploitation. So your experience might be that you're part of the exploited, but you have this vision of heaven, this vision of a spiritual reality, in which you're told, right, that it's blessed to be poor and that detachment from material goods is excellent. I was just reading this morning, I believe it's Colossians chapter 3, right? So if you've died with Christ, right, and you've already been buried with him, then you're to have your mind on heavenly things, not things of this earth, right? Because that's where Christ is, seated at the right hand of the Father. Well, I mean, Marx, looking at that, would say, that's a good way. That's a way to, if you're one of the exploited, to solve your alienation, right?
Yeah.
By spiritual consolation. And if you're the employer, right, you could say, well, I mean, let's keep our mind on heavenly things, folks. Let's not,
Don't worry about your 18-hour workdays.
That's right. Let's not worry about alienation. Our minds are on heavenly things, right? So it actually provides a kind of consolation both for certainly for the exploited, but even a kind of excuse or distraction, diversion, right, for the exploiter. And of course, also if you include any kind of view of providence, right, you might also say, providence kind of gives the stamp here. It's God's will that I'm the king or the prince or the factory owner or the shop owner, right? Thanks be to God that he gave me these things. So instead of seeing it, my ownership as a outcome for the competition for access to the means of production, which I should, right? I'm sorry, that's a lot to say. Instead of seeing it that way, I see it as the working out of divine providence. So it's there's a big critique of religion packed into Marxism. And again, you have to just basically accept it's true once you accept some of these materialistic premises, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
The structure view of culture. This also entails a view of history, which I can kind of explain, I think, a little more quickly, which is just that, if you accept that superstructure, right? Then similarly, what's history really about? History is really about the change in the means of production, right? So as relations of production change, so let me back up even more basic. As the means of production change, then relationships of production change, and then culture and consciousness changes, right? So you see, it kind of works its way up, right? Marx very clearly said, Hegel wanted to go from, a heavenly mind down to the concrete individual. And, Marx says, no, we invert that. We go from, the things of the earth to up, right? And so...
it sounds like the Tower of Babel to me.
That's just your religious consciousness speaking.
Yeah. Thanks for explaining it to me. I understand.
That's right.
Now I can work towards real freedom.
That's right. Work. As the means of production change, right? It's a fascinating way of thinking.
Yeah.
Technology really is the driver here, right? As technology changes, as the tools change, that changes social relationships. And then as social relationships change, that changes your culture and your consciousness. I'll give a very good example of this. One brief and one a little bit longer. One example of this would be, think about when intensive human labor with primitive tools is the primary form of production. Yeah. Within that, Marx is not surprised that slavery becomes the norm because of the inefficiency, right, of working in that way, right?
Yeah.
That for anyone to have much of a surplus, they're going to have to a surplus which allows them, right, any kind of leisure or anything like that. If anybody's going to have much freedom beyond just staying alive, they're going to need to subordinate others, right, at the lowest cost possible, which would, of course, would include slavery. So he's not surprised that under the certain material conditions that's what occurs. A more instructive example, though, even would be the example between when small artisans, right, that is when piececraft artisans were replaced by industrial production. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, you could be a weaver, or you could be, say, a gunsmith, right? And what you did as the gunsmith, right, is you did all of the things required. You might have used a little bit of help from other craftsmen, but you produced one musket at a time. And each musket primarily the product of your labor, right? Mm-hmm. And you could, because of the scarcity of such items, you could have a fairly decent, a small, but or medium size kind of prosperity, right? A kind of property, right? And standing within the community, right? You think about especially the United States of America and England, where small craftsmen are so important, right? I mean, they really have this kind of standing. When you think about somebody like, Paul Revere, he makes, dishes and cups, and like he's a silversmith and a pewter smith, right? That's kind of like that ideal, right?
Yeah.
We think about the weaver in England, right? And this is very instructive. The weavers were usually people in a community, and this had gone on for really generations, right? Where if you could afford to buy a loom and learn how to work it, you could actually make, again, you're not going to become rich, but you're going to, have what we would consider good middle class, existence, right? Well, along comes industrialization, right? And weaver, that loom, you might as well just set it on fire, right? Because all it's good. I mean, that thing went from literally, it could go from, in a matter of 1 year, being a piece of machinery of incredible value, right, to a year later being firewood, right? Yeah. And you think about that, you might think, okay, well, that's just technology. Tell that to the weaver. The weaver has just lost his place in society. He is no longer free. He is no longer has that position of dignity in his society, right? Like that changed his social relations. What does he have to do? Well, I'll tell you what the weavers did is they tried to burn down some of the textile mills. That's
one way.
Yeah, you understand why, right? It's ineffective ultimately. But what do they do? Well, they have to move to the city and become a laborer, right? Yep. So you go from being living in a village where you have a certain amount of respect and a certain livelihood to, in Marx's view, being a wage slave in a factory in squalid conditions in London or someplace like that.
Yeah, and you can see this, even today. Like, there was the I forget the whole kind of scandal thing, but it was there was a comment that was made, and it became just a kind of a meme that blew up. But it was when they were talking about shutting down all these coal mines and stuff, and they're like, well, what are these people going to do? And they just said, learn to code. And so that became a meme, was learn to code. Well, you just gotta, move on, move into, in a figurative sense, move into the city, become a laborer, and do something else. But again, like you said, that with industrialization, I mean, it literally it turned things that were the means of production to like today. If you can weave, that's a hobby.
Yeah, that's right.
It used to be the means of, that used to be the
livelihood.
The livelihood of some people, and today it's a hobby. So it is, and things like that have, very difficult, just bringing difficult problems for society. So.
Yeah, and I think you got to give Marx his point here, right? To some degree. I mean, I think he's right that like industrialization was, you could I mean, he's right up to a point. He's very wrong past that point, but he's right up to a point that industrialization carried with it enormous cultural and social damage.
Yeah, absolutely.
To people, and it's probably the case that societies and governments and various authorities were not sufficiently aware of that. I mean, you could just say, well, look, we increased the production of cloth by so many percentage points, and that's all that matters. Well, yeah, I mean, it might be true that you increase production that much. It's also not true that that's all that matters. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
There are other things involved here, and I think it's hard for us to realize, just because we're so used to machine production, right? We don't even. I mean, a lot of our factories don't exist in America anymore. Some do still, right? But like machine production is just so much part of our culture, right? Automated production, that we don't even think about what a radical change that was. Now, in the big picture, you could maybe say a change for the better. And far less humans have to do this kind of toilsome work, but it's a matter of debate, anyways.
Yeah, but I think it's from the Marxist perspective, though. Like, you just have to roll with it, because this is, again, if you have that Hegelian view of history,
yes,
we just have to understand. Okay, we are in this process towards freedom, and you just happen to be at one of the bad stages, and you got to. But it's important. But where you will find your freedom is if you realize your importance for this, for the realization of this freedom that is our goal.
That's right.
And once you understand that, you can be.
Yeah, that's true. And one of the key points is the proletariat, right? Is that as we'll see, is the proletariat is this disenfranchised group that he sees as advancing history and sort of realizing its own dignity in its advancing of history. Interestingly, as much as he recognizes the damage done by the Industrial Revolution, he also thinks that the move to industrial capitalism was, in fact, a necessary stage. That is, we needed to go beyond a tradition-based, inheritance-based, custom-based form of the means of production to a means of production that was actually competitive and unleashed productive powers that hadn't been there before. Mm-hmm. That sets the stage, he thinks, for socialism and eventually full communism as sort of the full outcome, right, of things. How much time do we have?
Yeah, I was going to say, we got about 20 minutes left. Do you think we could go through his critique of capitalism? Or?
I think we can, and then we can maybe expand on it. So, let's say capitalism is a part of the material dialectic, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a stage, but it's also a stage that is a necessary stage and a stage that has to be overcome, right?
Yeah.
And Marx believes inevitably will be overcome because it's necessary in the material dialectic.
Right.
What we're looking at is a greater and greater extent of productive freedom, right? And capitalism plays a role in bringing that about. At the same time, it has features that thwart human freedom and therefore need to be overcome. So let's think about that. First we need to understand the Marxist understanding of capitalism. Mm-hmm. So lots of times when those who don't study political philosophy hear the word capitalism, they think equals private property, or capitalism means voluntary market exchanges. Yeah. Now, I think both of those things are intimately connected to capitalism, but that's not exactly what Marx has in view here. What Marx has in view when he talks about capitalism is an economic system, an economic structure in which the capitalist own all of the means of production. Capitalist then becomes the real question, like, what is a capitalist? Who is a capitalist, right?
Yeah.
And that requires you to understand what is capital, right? So a capitalist is somebody who owns capital. Okay, fine. So what's capital? Yeah. Right? Das Kapital is Marx's great, gigantic economic work, right? And essentially in capital, what what Marx thinks of as capital is a kind of an excess resource that allows you to own the means of production and to create, at least in the minds of capitalists, wealth, right? Mm-hmm. So capital could be a forest, right? If you own a forest, right, then you think about all of the economic relations that you can create through the ownership of that forest.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
You right. That's a think about the Latin term capitas, right? Or is the root here. So it can mean head, like it's the beginning of, right? This whole process of economic relations. So if you own the wood, like a forest, right, those trees can be cut down. They can be, that's going to involve an economic relationship between the timber company, right, and the landowner. Then the timber company can sell it to a mill, right? The mill can turn it into usable lumber. The lumber can be sold to the furniture maker, right? All of that. You see how that all works?
Yeah,
It's kind of cascading down, right?
Yeah.
But each step, it's the person that has either the machinery or the resource, right?
Mm-hmm.
It could also be the banker who loans you money to buy, right, the forest. Do you see? Right?
Yeah.
And he's got like extra resources. So it could be money, right? So capital can be lots of different things, but it's something that's over and above the needs for just staying alive, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if I'm the banker and I've just got enough money to stay alive, I'm not going to loan you any money. I'm going to be a pretty bad banker. Right? Does that make sense? Right?
Yeah.
So it's an excess of resources that's above your needs for life that you can then turn around and make the source of creating various economic relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And that's source capital. Of exploitation, right?
That's right. Yes. So this sets up an exploitative structure, because you can say, well, what's so bad about that? In one way, I mean, from maybe a typical American point of view, you might say, well, it just sounds like investment, and production and all that sort of thing, right? You get a loan, you take a risk on taking the loan, you try to create a productive business out of it, etc. Right? Sounds entrepreneurial, right? The Marxist critics will say, no, it's not, and the reason is that it involves then a monopolization of the means of production by a particular class of people, namely the capitalist, right? So that if you don't have the situation in which you own capital in a capitalist system, then you don't have direct access or control of the means of production. This creates what's called the separation of capital and labor. All that you have left then that's of economic value to the economic structure is the expenditure of your personal energy and time, right? Do you follow that?
Yeah.
So you don't have the means of production, right? Like I don't own the lumber mill. I don't own the forest. All I can do is do what?
I can move the saw.
I sell my energy, right?
Yeah.
On the labor market. We even call it the labor market still, right? Treat it as if it's a commodity, right? And of course, it's in the interest of the capitalist to buy that commodity at the lowest price available, right? And then I go and I cut down all the trees. Let's say you're the lumber company owner, right? And you hire me and 10 other guys, and we go out there and we're taking all the risk, right? The trees falling on us. We're using the chainsaws. We're cutting it all down, right? It's our expenditure of time and energy, right, that is bringing about this change in the forest into lumber, right?
Yeah.
But we're doing that really not as an act of our own freedom, but as really instruments of your productivity, right? Because you own the chainsaws, right?
And because you own all the and because I own all the chainsaws, you're forced to come to me if you want to cut the tree down.
That's right.
If you want to
That's
do
right.
those things.
Yeah.
So so by
right.
controlling the means of labor, then I essentially turn you into, I exploit you as a worker.
That's right. Yeah. And Marx uses the term wage slave, right? I get a wage, so I feel like I'm free, right? You could say, oh, you're not a slave, I pay you. And Marx said, as little as possible, right? What the market will bear, right? And it's not as if I really have a choice. So what somebody might say in response is, Marx, wait a second, that's a freely, you entered that contract freely, right?
He would say no.
A lumberjack. And so this is an exercise of his freedom. And Marx would say no, right? He didn't own the means of production, and therefore he had to barter away his labor, right, to someone else, right? So really, I'm not free. I'm having to conform to structures and relationships outside of my own will, right? There's a little Hegelian flavor to that, right? And so there's two sides of this that are exploitative. One, I become degraded in the sense that I have to sell my labor to you. Literally, while I'm on the clock, right, I'm like a shovel in your hands, right? My labor is no longer an expression of my freedom, my autonomy, my human spirit, right? I don't think we should be cutting these trees down this way. I think we should be doing it this way, right? Right? All that's an expression of, this isn't mine. I'm just doing what I'm told. I'm an instrument, right, in the hands of the capitalist. So that while I'm on the clock for those 8 hours or whatever it is, I am merely an instrument, right? And I'm therefore degraded in my human spirit. Second, Marx has what is called the labor theory of value. Now, this is, I don't want to go into the weeds here too much, but basically labor theory of value is the view that labor creates value in the object, in the artifact. Most economists today reject the labor theory of value. Interestingly, the labor theory of value was held by both Adam Smith and Karl Marx, who don't agree on lots of things, but agree on the labor theory of value. Most economists today hold what's called a market theory of value, right? That is that the demand relative to supply is what creates the value of the product or service. So I think that's an interesting argument people can have on their own. Okay, I don't want to stake out any claims about that.
Sure.
Marx certainly thought about the labor theory of value, and not just thought of it, that's what he endorsed. And so let's go from lumber. So we go from the trees to the lumber, going back to me as a lumberjack. If I'm the lumberjack, right, and I'm creating a situation in which, through my labor, that the forest can now be sold, right? The wood from that can be sold at a higher price, especially over time, so that both the lumberjack owner, or so the lumber company owner and the landowner make more money, right? Like, you can't really sell a tree one at a time, right? For a property, right? And then, down the line, as you go to the mill worker who turns that raw lumber into timber that can, or raw timber that can be turned into lumber, excuse me. And then the lumber that can then be turned into a chair, right? All along the line, it's the workers, right, who don't own the means of production. It's the labor that's creating, right, creating value in the object. The object is, the product is getting more and more valuable, right? Raw timber is not as valuable per pound as well-made furniture, right?
Sure.
And so, and how does that greater value come about? Through labor, right? And so, but because the carpenter and the lumberjack don't own the means of production, they're only compensated at the lowest possible value for the labor market, right? And who gets the rest? The owner of the capital, even though the owner of the capital did not create the value in the product, right? So literally, it's a kind of theft. In Marx's view.
So capitalism separates people into. So this is kind of a understanding of capitalism then, of what does it do to a society then. So it creates and divides people into different classes just based on socioeconomic relationships. It leads to the exploitation of the majority of the people, because the means of production are only owned by a few. Right. And it creates just this class conflict, which must be overcome in Marxist view to lead to our true expression of freedom.
That's right. Yeah, and key here, right, is this structure not only creates class conflict, right? That class conflict is primarily in one direction, at least from a capitalist perspective, which is that the owners of capital exploit labor, right? They degrade their humanity and steal the value, right? Alienate the value of the product that's made, right? Yeah. So those are the two. I mean, there's more to be said actually, but those are two key elements in seeing what is ethically wrong, right? Yeah. With capitalism. There are other things that Marx has to say about that are sort of technically and economically wrong. Like he thinks that capitalism is an irrational, unsustainable system that must collapse in on itself at a certain point.
Yeah, it's that necessary stage within the view of history that leads this. Now,
can I go just a little bit further?
Yeah. No, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I just want to talk about that just a little bit. So what he thinks is the reason he thinks that it's capitalism is ultimately irrational, right? Is that he thinks it creates the conditions for its own destruction, which is really interesting, right? And the way it does that is through the exploitation of labor in order to compete with other capitalists. It's not as if the capitalists, capitalists like other capitalists, but they also want to be the biggest capitalist, right? Because not all of them, but at least enough of them, right? Because it's put it this way, we don't speak this way, but the truth is, right, capitalist society is a desperate struggle to maintain your social value and your freedom, right? Yeah. And because of that, right, and the way to do that is to get and keep capital, which makes it an inherently competitive system. You see how that works, right? Yeah. So whatever nice things we may say, it's really me against my neighbor, right? And I gotta get mine, right? And so what you do then as a capitalist inevitably is, well, in order to stay competitive, you want to produce at the cheapest level possible, or the least expensive level possible. And there are various ways of controlling cost, but whether through innovation or whatever, really the go-to most consistent way of reducing cost is by reducing the cost of labor. Yeah. And so there's a constant pressure within a capitalist system to drive down the cost of labor. Why is that problematic? It's problematic because then it gradually impoverishes labor, what he calls the proletariat, right? Who are the kind of disenfranchised worker, even if he has the vote, doesn't matter. He doesn't have capital. And so he's disenfranchised in the sense he doesn't have a real say in his economic relations. And he's being constantly impoverished because of this downward pressure on wages in order to keep, in order to be more competitive, right? So over time, what happens is, as he says, as Marx says famously, that capitalism creates the grave diggers that will bury it, right? Is that two things happen. One is the proletariat becomes so impoverished that they can't afford the goods that they produce. And what that means is a collapse in demand. Yeah, you're going to have some rich people that are going to have demand, right? And for goods and services. But your broad swath of your population is going to be this impoverished proletariat who can't afford anything beyond just the means of survival. And so you have a collapse in demand, which leads to the Great Depression. The other thing that happens is eventually the ability of the proletariat to get enough distribution to sustain life begins to evaporate. And that's when the proletariat revolts and seizes the means of production for itself so that they can be free and survive.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah. So, all right, we're going to have to do another podcast.
There's a lot to say.
Oh gosh. Yeah. There's so much here, not just with capitalism, but now you brought in, the proletariat revolting against, the capitalists, this idea of revolution as kind of the car that we drive this view of history down, brings up all sorts of other questions and topics.
Yeah.
Gosh, I hate to end here, but we have to.
Okay.
But I just want to thank you, Dr. Smith, for guiding us through this thing. I want to invite all our listeners. If you haven't listened to our first one, go back and listen to it, and please join us for the next one. Again, this topic is so important for us to understand, because many of these ideas are finding their way back into popular thought, and are starting to actually begin to enter into the realm of possibility. And so it's important for us to recognize maybe some of those different aspects and try to refute them, or at least understand them to the point of, putting them on a road to correction. And so I want to invite all our listeners, check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Until next time, God bless.